for a large part of his life, a Westmoreland man has combined his love for God with his love for flying. And as you're about to see, CordellAkin has held two major titles during his lifetime: pastor and missionary pilot.
I guess I'd say I was interested in missions in all of my life, but I was a pastor in San Diego, California. And in 1967, I went to the Southern Baptist Convention in Miami, Florida. They had a foreign missions night on Thursday. So, and I sat down, I opened up the program, and in huge letters it says, "Needed Now," and several countries where missionaries were needed. And Tanzania was one of those. And it just struck my attention. I think God was pointing me in that direction. And I went and talked to the Foreign Mission Board representative the next day, went back to San Diego at the end of the week, and was excited about the fact that I may go to Tanzania as a missionary.
Had you ever been to Africa before that?
No, never been to Africa. I've been to the Middle East before, but never to Africa.
And before you started flying to Africa, how long had you been a pilot? Do you remember off the top of your head?
When I was in graduate school in the Southern Baptist Seminary called Golden Gate in Northern California, in 1963, didn't have much money, but there was a little grass airstrip north of the seminary, so I went up there and started taking lessons in a small tailwheel airplane, and I got my license in 1963, so been doing that for a good while now.
And talk about maybe, do you remember a little bit about maybe your first ever missionary trip to Africa, kind of what it was like and what your thoughts were of the African people, maybe the scenery in Africa, things like that?
That's an interesting thing you asked, because it's always been very impressive to me. When we left Africa, they were circling the moon for the first time. They were not landing there, but it's when Apollo 8, I think, was circling the moon. We went on a cold winter day on Lufthansa and flew into Germany. And it was cold, oh so cold. Got on a British Airways, BOAC flight, and we flew south of the equator about 200 miles and landed in Nairobi, Kenya. And out of that cold, icy Europe, we got off the plane and it was warm. There were palm trees and flowers and everything, and it was so beautiful. And we drove over the countryside to go where we were going to be staying for 6 months studying language, the Swahili language. There were tea fields, beautiful tea fields and coffee plantations. And I remember saying when I was driving there, wow, how have I missed this all of my life? And then we got to the place where we were staying, and the Africans were so friendly, so nice, and I just began to fall in love with them, you know, from the very beginning. It was a real affinity that I had with them, but that was my first introduction to Africa, and it was a wonderful one.
And being a missionary pilot, what exactly did you take to Africa? Did you take food supplies at all, or were you just there to be maybe preaching the word, so to speak?
Well, it was a combination of things. The first thing we did was we used the airplane in evangelism. Tanzania is large, the size of Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. We had 18 mission stations, and so we carried Africans and missionaries around from station to station to preach and to hold Bible classes. Like, we take them the first part of the week and then go back and pick them up after they taught all week. Then I would take supplies, tires, gas, bottled gas, vegetables to places where they couldn't get vegetables. So I would carry dogs, and I've carried goats and chickens and pet snakes. I mean, it's just amazing how many things you end up carrying. And then we use it for medical purposes too. Someone has, way out in the bush, they have a medical problem, and go out and get them, fly them up to Nairobi where they can get medical help. And so, and I guess the other big thing is all of the kids in Tanzania went to school at a place called Kijabi. It's a Africa Inland Mission boarding school, and they run a trimester system, 3 months there, 1 month off. And so we had about 15 kids in Tanzania who went to school there. So 3 times a year, I would fly around Tanzania, pick up all the kids on 2 or 3 trips, take them up to Nairobi, then they would bus 50 miles out to the school, and then repeat that again each time up and back. So I carried kids a lot.
And while you were there, you also hunted for meat, you said. What kind of animals did you actually kill and that finally prepare and eat?
Well, Tanzania in those years, in the 70s and 80s, was a strong socialist country. As bad or worse than Cuba has been over the last few years. So all the shops were empty. You couldn't go buy food like you would here. There's just empty shelves everywhere. So if we wanted meat, we had to hunt for it. So I would go once a month or sometimes every other month, and we would hunt like eland, hartebeest, wildebeest, Thompson's gazelle, even zebra, and ostrich, just all kinds of meat like that. And one of a Cape buffalo, a huge buffalo with horns, and we would butcher this in the field, take it back to the city, share it with other missionaries who didn't hunt, and with pastors, so the African pastors, we'd go by their house and give them a big piece of meat, and they were just pleased because they had no way to go out and hunt themselves. They didn't have the guns or any way to do it. So we got all of our meat that way.
I ask you this question off camera. I'll ask you the question on camera for our viewers. What does zebra taste like?
It tastes like beef. All the animals in East Africa, because they're out on the plain eating grass and running around a lot, are mostly lean. There's not much fat on there, so you have to cook with gravy and other stuff, when you're going to eat it. But we'd have sometimes guests come from the United States, and we'd serve zebra. And we wouldn't tell them, though, in advance that we're serving zebra. And after we finish, we'd often ask, well, how'd you like the meat? Oh, that was really good. That's best stuff we've had, in a long time. And say, well, that was zebra. And there's kind of a silence sometimes. It's just the thought about it, but it's good. It's good. All the meat you eat is good.
How long did you do this? How many years were you going back in?
20 years. And I was an evangelist. I preached in the Swahili language, worked with the Africans, starting churches and villages and so forth. And then I began 2 English language Baptist churches, one in Dar es Salaam, one in Arusha. There were a lot of people who came to Dar, the capital, who did not speak Swahili. They were in the embassies, because that was the capital city, a lot of people for aid programs, so they were looking for something in English. Okay. So that church that we began in 1971, is still going strong. In fact, not long ago, earlier last year, they were looking for a pastor to come from America to pastor that church. So that went on like that for 10 years. And then the last 10 years, I was a pilot full-time for the mission as I continued to pastor those English language churches.
Tell me what you're wearing today.
Well, I'm wearing this for the sake to let you know what I wore every day in Africa, and that's the epaulets and the tie. What I found was in the airports in Tanzania and the other African countries, they're suspicious about little airplanes. They're suspicious sometimes in the more rural places if you're white. And there were a lot of revolutionary movements going on and working in Africa in those days, and they have. It's not like police, but in all the airports, they have the military station around with AK-47s. And what I found was if I just wore jeans and a shirt, I walked out on the ramp to go to the airplane, they're going to stop me. They're going to know who I am and where I'm going. So what I found is if I dress professionally, wear the captain's epaulets, the tie, they know that I'm a pilot. They understand that. And so I have freedom to move in and out of the airport. So that's why I started doing that.
How did this change your life, would you say? You did this for 20 years. How did it change it for the better?
Well, I had always thought when I entered graduate school in the seminary that I was going to be a pastor. And I did pastor 2 churches in California. But when I went to Africa, it was such a radical change, and so different. I remember there were a group of us, about a dozen or 15. We were appointed one night in Richmond, Virginia, at a church service there, and as missionaries for the Southern Baptist Convention Foreign Mission Board. And I remember telling the group afterwards, I said, "Gee, now I'm a missionary. what do I do? I didn't know what a missionary was supposed to do. I mean, I knew we preached and all of that, but it was not until I got to Africa and started doing the variety of things that was there to do that I began to see how hard it was in a certain way, how difficult the circumstances were to live in another way, but yet how rewarding it was to be able to be there and to help, first of all, with the gospel presentation, and then to be a support for those who were preaching the gospel by using aviation to expand our ministries.
You've lived in Westmoreland, Tennessee now for about 10 years. How did you wind up in Westmoreland?
Well, I was pastoring after I came back from Africa in 1988, lived in New Mexico and pastored 2 churches out there in Los Alamos and northern New Mexico, and then circumstances in life, I left Los Alamos. Had a flight school out there, and it wasn't making it financially, and there was a house available here that my parents had owned before they passed, and it was sitting empty, so I moved back to Westmoreland. But I never thought I'd live in Tennessee. You know, I like the West, and coming back from Africa, I'd lived over there, and then coming to Tennessee. I mean, I like Tennessee too, but I just couldn't envision myself coming to a small town like Westmoreland, living there again, although I'd been associated with it all my life. Through my parents, you know, and their relatives.
Well, now that you've made the adjustment a couple of years later, tell me how is life for you these days?
Oh, it's great. It's wonderful. God is blessed. I've pastored a couple of churches here, Red Boiling Springs First Baptist, Grace Baptist Church in Bethpage, and had wonderful experiences doing that. I love to preach still, and I love to fly. And so here at Lafayette Airport, we have a nonprofit organization called Turning Point at Sunrise, and part of it is an aviation program. So I've been teaching a ground school for 12 weeks at the old elementary school in Westmoreland. We're coming to the end of that. We've had 15 enrolled, well, actually 20 enrolled totally in that. And then we have an airplane that we've purchased not long ago. It's a charitable organization. I'm flying and teaching in that airplane, and it's just wonderful at my stage in life now to still be able to fly and teach. I enjoy that immensely. I enjoy preaching. I just enjoy the life that I've been able to have.
A man who says his life has been richly blessed, not only from his days as a pastor, but also as a missionary pilot. Reporting in Lafayette, Barry Hyatt, NCTV.